50 years ago, when I was a teenager, staying with my elder sister during school holidays, I began a lifelong habit of wandering the London streets and looking into churches. The nearest was St. Stephen's, Gloucester Road, and I can still remember my excitement, realizing this was where the celebrated poet TS Eliot had worshipped.
In one of his late poems, Eliot said old men ought to be explorers. Well, I'm an old man in his late 60s, and in this programme, I'm going to be an explorer too.
I will follow the spiritual journey that Eliot makes in such extraordinary poems as the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock and The Wasteland.
April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain.
My travels will take me to the English seaside and the east coast of America. From the city of London to a Somerset village, to find a place that is full of light and beauty, but also dark and mysterious, where Eliot grapples with weighty ideas of time and memory, faith and belief, alienation and loss, asking us, in his words, to see the boredom and the horror and the glory.
Eliot was, beyond question, one of the greatest, I should say the greatest, poet writing in the English language in the last 100 years, who dared to be difficult, venturing to the frontiers of consciousness and beyond in search of what he called the deeper unnamed feelings, who dared to defend a higher culture, which many mediocre people today would dismiss as elitist, who wasn't afraid to ask those questions we so often try to evade in our own lives. Who are we? What are we doing here?
With all this in mind, come with me to the real and imagined places of his poetic world, where he speaks to me, and I hope can speak to you too. The life of Thomas Stearns Eliot was rarely full of joy, but it was bookended with happiness. Eliot spent the first 25 years of his life in America, which he later revealed provided the sources and the emotional springs of his poems. He was born in the Midwest on the 26th of September 1888 in the city of St. Louis, beside the mighty Mississippi River. Summers were spent here at Eastern Point, the family holiday home on the coast of Massachusetts. With older sisters and a brother Henry, Tom was the baby of the family.
Here's his father, Henry Ware Eliot, a businessman, always rather a remote figure. Eliot used to say it was more like having an ancestor than a parent. And here's his mother, Charlotte. What a strong resemblance there is between Tom Eliot and Charlotte in the face. She was much given to good works, and she was herself a published poet. Her work was full of religiosity, visions, redemption, martyrdom, themes which would be explored in her son's work. And here he is, young Tom, out on the veranda there, his nose buried in a book, always a voracious reader. When he was 12 years old, they found him reading Milton's Samson Agonistes. What a precocious child.
But there were other pleasures to be had beyond home and books, where Eliot became sensitive to landscape and seascape. In his teens, Eliot learnt to sail, leading his boat out of nearby Gloucester Harbour for journeys up the coast, sometimes in perilous conditions. The seas that he navigated would become places of drama, solace, and revelation. From his memories, he created lines of lyric intensity, like these, read by Eliot himself.
From the wide window toward the granite shore, the white sails still fly seaward, seaward flying unbroken wings. And the lost heart stiffens and rejoices in the lost lilac and the lost sea voices.
After schooling in St. Louis, Eliot went to the exclusive Milton Academy outside Boston, where he fine-tuned his Latin and Greek. In 1906, he went to Harvard. During his undergraduate years, he took 25 different courses, everything from literature to philosophy, psychology to anthropology and comparative religion, and learnt German and French. This was the foundation of the extraordinary erudition that made him one of the most learned poets of the 20th century. During these student years, Eliot had little interest in contemporary writers, but he did read 19th century French symbolist poets who, he said, stimulated in him wholly new feeling, combining the sordidly realistic and phantasmagoric, qualities which would become evident in Eliot's early poetry. But above all, he began avidly to consume somebody who captivated me at the same age, the medieval Italian poet Dante.
This is the handy little Temple Classics edition of Dante's Divine Comedy that we both read. I bought this copy for myself when I was 17 years old. It's got Italian down one side, and on the opposite page, the English translation. Eliot used to say he lay in bed or went on railway journeys with it and memorized long passages. And this, it seems to me, Dante, is the one poet that we can truly say was T.S. Eliot's mentor. He said he was the most persistent and the deepest influence on his own poetry. And the journey that Dante made in the Divine Comedy, from Inferno, hell, through the suffering of purgatory, with glimpses of paradise or heaven, is the self-same journey, it seems to me, that Eliot himself would make.
At Harvard, inspired by Dante, Eliot began to write and get poems published in university magazines. His reputation was such that he was given the honor of writing a celebratory ode that was sung here at the Sanders Theatre during his year's graduation ceremony in 1910.
Ode, Thomas Stearns Eliot. Let me just read the opening lines. For the hour that is left us, fair Harvard, with thee, ere we face the importunate years, in thy shadow we wait, while thy presence dispels our vain hesitations and fears. It's conventional versifying. And it's astonishing to think that at the very time he was penning that ode, Eliot was also writing the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. It's so different from the tame anthology pieces that Eliot's contemporaries were writing. I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree. I must go down to the seas again, to the lonely sea and the sky. I wouldn't follow those poets on their fantasy journey, but I would follow Prufrock, because what Eliot said he wanted from a poem was the violent stimulus of novelty and the element of surprise.
Eliot had learnt from the French symbolists that a city could offer much to a poet which was strange and unsettling to readers, and this encouraged him to come up with lines of striking originality. A polluting yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes. The poem's protagonist, Prufrock, a name taken from a St. Louis furniture company, walks streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent. Poor Prufrock feels ill at ease because in the room the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. And he is forced to ask himself, should I, after tea and cakes and ices, have the strength to force the moment to its crisis? Lines like these, with their power of fresh invention, were the shock of the new that led George Orwell to call Prufrock the starting point of modern literature.
So who is Prufrock? He's running away from an overwhelming question which he doesn't want to answer. Does he dare to live, or will he measure out his life with coffee spoons? Balding, timorous of women, indeed at times almost ridiculous. In this passage, he explores his dilemma. I grow old, I grow old, I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. Shall I part my hair behind? Do I dare to eat a peach? I shall wear white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. I have heard the mermaids singing, each to each. I do not think that they will sing to me.
Although Prufrock is middle-aged, Eliot admitted there was something of himself in the poem, the anxious masculinity of a 21-year-old. But should he dare in his own life, dare to love? In 1912, as a graduate at Harvard, Eliot first met aspiring actress Emily Hale. He began to fall for Emily, and she became muse to some early poems. But for 2 years, Eliot hesitated to declare his love, indecisive in a very Prufrock way. On the eve of a year abroad, he finally did. But according to Eliot in old age, he didn't feel his feelings were returned in any degree whatever. He left Boston and America rejected, in mourning for this first love. Now Eliot's journey took him to England, when in the summer of 1914 he arrived on a travelling fellowship to study at Merton College, Oxford, taking rooms on Staircase 2, St Albans Quad. He was keen to further his intellectual horizons, truly global now, having learnt Sanskrit to read Eastern holy texts in the original. All this was part of an ambition to become a philosopher. A clue to his time here can be found in the register of books in the college's medieval library, where you can see he's taken out a 16th century commentary on Aristotle.
Eliot had chosen to write his thesis about the idealist philosopher F.H. Bradley, who was a Merton don here, said to prowl the quadrangles at night shooting cats, but by day something of a recluse. So, although Eliot had crossed the Atlantic specially to be in the same college, he never actually met the great man. Nevertheless, Bradley's famous book, Appearance and Reality, had a profound effect on Eliot, particularly regarding his notions of time.
When he was at Oxford, Eliot met two people who were to change his life. The first was a fellow American, the poet, critic, and cultural impresario, Ezra Pound. Pound was stunned when he first read Prufrock. He said it was the best poem I've yet seen from an American, proof that Eliot had trained and modernized himself on his own. With promise like this, Ezra was convinced that Tom should write more poems, not waste his time studying philosophy. Then, at a party, Eliot met the bohemian and vivacious Vivien Haigh-Wood, working at the time as a governess. He was smitten. Vivien had ambitions to write and paint, and Eliot said she had a genius for dancing. And no slouch on the dance floor himself, the couple came together over a love of such exotic imports from America as the foxtrot and the grizzly bear. Within months of their meeting, and on impulse, he decided to leave academic life entirely and marry this thoroughly modern spirit. Neither set of parents were told until after the event. But from the start, married life was full of tensions and complications. The Eliots moved to grim and austere wartime London. Their first real home was here, at the newly built Crawford Mansions off the Marylebone Road. His mother called the marriage a great misfortune. His father had made it clear his son should now support his new wife. So having gambled on his future, Eliot now faced the long hours of a working life. How many times he must have wearily climbed these stairs, returning exhausted from teaching at a prep school and lecturing to adults. He then got a job working at Lloyd's Bank in the city. Vivien, however, saw her husband's future not as a clerk, but as a famous artist.
Vivien believed in Eliot as a writer. She had a passionate belief in Tom's genius as a poet, and herself as somebody who could gain him recognition. I provide the motive power, I shove, she used to say. Now, none of us can ever know the truth about somebody else's marriage, but it's fairly clear that this one was a disaster. After the honeymoon, Vivien said it had been a ghastly failure, talking about the sex, presumably.
Another early threat was the philosopher Bertrand Russell, who'd first met Eliot when he was lecturing at Harvard and now befriended the young newlyweds in London. Bertie took advantage of their unhappy conjugal state to initiate an affair with Vivien. And Eliot quickly realized he'd married a very vulnerable person, one who suffered from nervous exhaustion, migraines, irregular and heavy periods, and stomach complaints, conditions that bewildered and frightened him. He was often ill himself, tired and depressed, an existence he called numbing and paralyzing. And in England, he felt an outsider. In a letter to his brother, Henry, he confided, "One is always coming up against differences of feeling that make one feel humiliated and lonely. One remains always the foreigner."
All this private hell, he later confessed, brought the state of mind out of which came the wasteland.
The Wasteland was a poem written after a catastrophic war and during its chaotic aftermath, when it seemed that the world was in ruins after a collective nervous breakdown. In October 1921, Eliot himself was close to collapse. With Vivien, he came to the Kent seaside resort of Margate. He was 33 and still working at the bank, which gave him 3 months off to try and recover. Eliot brought with him the first drafts of a long poem he'd been mulling over for a year or so. One day, he came to this seaside shelter, close to a memorial to drowned sailors, and wrote lines of poetry inspired by the place and by his black mood.
On Margate sands, I can connect nothing with nothing, the broken fingernails of dirty hands. My people, humble people who expect nothing.
The Wasteland is, I think, the greatest poem of the 20th century. I've been reading it all my adult life, over and over again, and I always find something new in it. In his Prufrock poem, Eliot spoke with one voice, but in The Wasteland, a toweringly more ambitious work, there's a whole chorus of voices, what his fellow poet Ted Hughes called an assemblage of human cries. And they're all damaged people. Out of his own misery, Eliot came to speak for a generation, believing that a writer could transmute his own personal and private agonies into something rich and strange, into something universal and impersonal. And this, surely, is what we see in The Wasteland. Nearly 50 years after The Wasteland first appeared in 1922, the original manuscripts were published, so we can see for ourselves how The Wasteland evolved as a poem and appreciate the editing skills of Ezra Pound, whom Eliot turned to for help, whose shaping of the finished work he acknowledged in the poem's dedication, calling Pound il meglio fabbro, the better craftsman, after a tribute Dante gave to a brother poet.
From the very first page, you can see Pound's influence on The Wasteland. For instance, here's the title page typed up, and Eliot had put in an epigraph from Joseph Conrad's novel, Heart of Darkness, those desolate words, the horror, the horror. Pound didn't like them, so they went. And then when you turn to the opening passage of the poem, The Burial of the Dead, Pound put his pencil through the first 54 lines. So now it begins with the immortal words, April is the cruelest month. And by the end, Pound had culled several hundred lines from this poem. What he was doing, Pound, was removing the element of simple story, the narrative interest. He was trying to make The Wasteland more fragmentary, more mysterious. And as a result, it's so much better.
Within this broken-backed structure, Eliot creates haunting landscapes out of a world at war with itself. For example, the city of London that he walked through every day on his way to work at the bank. Using a familiar place like this, he paraphrases Dante's Inferno to turn his fellow commuters into the living dead.
Unreal city, under the brown fog of a winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge. So many I had not thought death had undone so many. Sighs, short and infrequent, were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet. Flowed up the hill and down King William Street, to where St. Mary Woolnoth kept the hours with a dead sound on the final stroke of 9.
Poetry like this is a challenge. Without doubt, coming to The Wasteland for the first time, it's not easy reading.
Many people have found this poem extremely confusing. It's jam-packed with quotations from the Buddha to the Bible, from Dante to Baudelaire. And it's a whole stream of allusions to pagan rites and ceremonies, to the legends of the Holy Grail and the Fisher King. But all this wasn't just put in to show off or to alienate people. The erudition had an urgent purpose. Eliot believed that the culture of the past could nourish the present, and that he could use it to modernize poetry. And furthermore, he believed that by standing on the shoulders of giants, he could safeguard that civilization which in the carnage of war had itself become a waste land.
Eliot believed writers creating a new poetics could feel justified in plundering history in this way. "We do not imitate," he wrote, "we are changed. We have not borrowed, we have been quickened. We have become the bearers of tradition." The wasteland was a supreme expression of modernism that changed not only literature but all art forms. In music, the primitive rhythms of Stravinsky's recent Rite of Spring had captured for Eliot the barbaric cries of modern life. Like fellow modernist James Joyce, in his novel Ulysses, published the same year as The Wasteland in 1922, Eliot also confronted contemporary taboos. I'm in the pub across the road from Crawford Mansions, where closing time here is recorded in the poem's second section, a game of chess, with the refrain, "Hurry up, please, it's time." Also in this section, a couple have an argument. First, "My nerves are bad tonight. Yes, bad. Stay with me." Then, "Speak to me. Why do you never speak? Speak." Alongside this passage, Pound wrote photography to acknowledge it as a snapshot of real life. And what's truly curious is that Vivien has added "wonderful" in appreciation of its authenticity, when surely these lines reflect the febrile state of their own marriage.
Along with this misery, we're faced with a brothel scene, a despairing mother of 5 talks about her abortion, and we meet an unmarried typist who has joyless sex. Now that's done, and I'm glad it's over, she says. Eliot shows no tenderness, no sense of real intimacy between the sexes. Some have even argued that in The Wasteland and other poems, Eliot harboured a hatred of women. I don't get that sense, but undoubtedly he had a crippling fear of sex, which is what prompted one friend, having read this masterpiece, to observe, "It's Tom's autobiography, a melancholy one."
Eliot wrote the final part of The Wasteland far from Margate Sands, in a Swiss sanatorium, over the course of one afternoon, in a trance-like state. He later said, "I wasn't even bothering whether I understood what I was saying." In this last section, What the Thunder Said, Eliot imagines a traveller venturing into desert and then mountains in a desperate search for water, leaving the city behind. Cracks and reforms and bursts in the violet air, falling towers, Jerusalem, Athens, Alexandria, Vienna, London, unreal. Here, civilization is in ruins, but Eliot is left thirsting for some kind of inner personal resolution. Eliot thought this was the best part of The Wasteland, and Pound made no changes to it, writing on the manuscript, "Okay from here on, I think." Towards the end, Eliot abandoned punctuation, advising the lines be read aloud in a sort of monotone, where the hermit thrush sings in the pine trees, drip, drop, 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 but there is no water. The Wasteland is despondent to the end, but concludes with more quotation and Sanskrit invocations to give, have compassion and self-control, and find peace, peace, peace.
These fragments I have shored against my ruins. Why then I'll fit you, Hieronymo's mad again, Datta, Dayatvam, Damyata, Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.
Peace was, of course, what Eliot's generation had little of. They faced what he called the immense panorama of futility and anarchy which is contemporary history. The wasteland was the poetic expression of that, offering little consolation or resolution in the face of such catastrophe. Yet it made Eliot's name as a poet. He was now a significant figure in literary London, the successful insider rather than the anxious outsider. One sign Eliot was going up in the world was when, in 1925, he left Lloyd's Bank and joined publishers Faber and Dwyer. On the third floor, 24 Russell Square, was his modest office.
Here Eliot sat, encouraging generations of poets from W.H. Auden to Dylan Thomas, from David Jones to Ted Hughes, and making Faber the most prestigious publisher of poetry in Britain. But at 37 years old, he was no happier. The demands of Vivien's illnesses were relentless. She was often bedridden. Sometimes he feared she was going to die, and he was racked with guilt that he was cold, distant, and uncaring towards his wife. He confided in a friend, "I have made myself into a machine to endure, in order not to feel, but it has killed Vivien." This was a man in hell, asking himself why it should be so.
Eliot now tried to find an answer in Christianity. Perhaps faith could at least move him from Inferno towards a state of purgatory. In America, his grandfather had been a Unitarian minister. Unitarians aspire to be progressive and rational, with no fixed doctrine and an informality of worship. But at this point in his life in Britain, Eliot was looking for something different, with more ritual and discipline. On the 29th of June 1927, he was baptized into the Church of England. He chose its Anglo-Catholic wing that offered the sacraments of the Mass and Confession. And he wrote the poem Ash Wednesday to give voice to his conversion.
Ash Wednesday, the first day of Lent, the beginning of Christ's 40 days in the wilderness. It's the day when the priest marks our forehead with ash in the form of a cross as a symbol of penance and renunciation. For Eliot, conversion meant a new life of penitence and austerity. It also meant a new poetry, something much more personal. This is almost the first poem he published using the first person. Ash Wednesday, 1930. Because I do not hope to turn again, because I do not hope, because I do not hope to turn, desiring this man's gift and that man's scope, I no longer strive towards such things.
In Ash Wednesday, Eliot turned his back on the style of the wasteland and its many allusions to modern life. In this poem, he reinvented his language, took words from liturgy and prayers to give it the rhythm and cadence of worship, and used poetic images that were much more traditional and often drawn from the natural world.
But the fountain sprang up and the birds sang down, redeem the time, redeem the dream, the token of the word unheard, unspoken, till the wind shake 1,000 whispers from the yew. And after this our exile,
Eliot described Ash Wednesday as the experience of a man in search of God. The challenge for a poet is how to handle such a theme without mawkishness or cliché. And I think in this beautiful poem, he succeeded triumphantly. It becomes a prayer to God, but it is also a cry to his mother and to his sister Charlotte, both of whom had lately died. Our peace in his will, and even among these rocks, sister, mother, and spirit of the river, spirit of the sea, suffer me not to be separated, and let my cry come unto thee.
Eliot's new religious fervour dismayed old friends and supporters. Ezra Pound lamented that Eliot was abandoning the Muses for Moses. Another complained that he now had demons on the brain. Undeterred, Eliot pursued faith in its severest and most penitential form, claiming, "I feel nothing could be too ascetic, too violent for my needs."
But this almost Manichaean view of good and evil reflects a less tolerant side of Eliot. And here we enter the darkest part of our journey. That is the persistent accusation that he was an anti-Semite. The evidence for this is found in quite a number of poems that he wrote during his 20s. One of them, Burbank with a Baedeker, Bleistein with a cigar, describes a Jewish visitor to Venice almost as if he were a threat to civilization itself. Chicago Semite Viennese, a lusterless, protrusive eye, stares from the protozoic slime at a perspective of Canaletto, the smoky candle end of time declines, on the Rialto once. The rats are underneath the piles. The Jew is underneath the lot. Money in furs.
How could such a sensitive and cultured man have written these abhorrent lines? Certainly, Eliot had grown up with parents who had anti-Semitic views. His mother once told her son she had an instinctive antipathy to Jews. Father never liked to have business dealings with them. Then there is the influence of his friend and collaborator, Ezra Pound, who had become one of the most notorious literary anti-Semites of his time. So, the sad truth is that these prejudices tainted the circles Eliot frequented, from his youth in America to the intelligentsia in England in the 20s and 30s.
But to try to explain is not to excuse. Eliot went on publishing these offending poems long after the horrors of the Second World War. Nevertheless, however repelled we may be by them, I don't think there could ever be a case for censoring Eliot. He was a genius, and I want to know the whole man. But I confess to being absolutely baffled by how such a decent person could ever have expressed such views.
With his embrace of Anglo-Catholicism, Eliot also took a vow of celibacy, a decision which could hardly have helped Vivien and the precarious state of their marriage. By 1933, he felt he could no longer live with her and had his lawyer, draw up a letter of separation, justifying this by saying that she was, paradoxically, physically indifferent to him, and he found her unpleasant. He went to live with priests in Spartan lodgings near St. Stephen's Church, where he attended 6:30 Mass every morning before work. However, Vivien began to turn up at the office, hoping she could change his mind and persuade him to return home.
Tipped off, Eliot would escape through this back door. And the pursuit went on all over London for the next 5 years as Vivien's mental health deteriorated. She was suffering from delusions. She thought she was being followed. And then, in July 1938, she was found wandering in the street at 5 o'clock in the morning in a confused state. And her brother agreed to the doctor's recommendation that she should be confined to a mental hospital.
How would Eliot express this continuing turmoil and the new course his life had taken? The answer came when, walking in the Cotswolds, he came by chance upon the gardens of a manor house, Burnt Norton. What he saw and felt here provided the first spark of inspiration for a last great outpouring of poetic creativity. This is Four Quartets, the work that marks the final stage of Eliot's spiritual journey in verse, where he searches for paradise after purgatory and seeks atonement for the past, of things ill done and done to others' harm. The first quartet, called Burnt Norton, opens with a meditation on the riddle of time, the subject that had fascinated him since studying F.H. Bradley at Oxford 20 years earlier.
Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable.
When Eliot came to Burnt Norton, he was not alone. He was accompanied by Emily Hale, his first love from Boston all those years ago. As his marriage unraveled, the loving platonic relationship between him and Emily was reanimated, but they couldn't take it any further. Eliot's faith precluded that. So although the poem, Burnt Norton, is full of joy, it is also shot through with the poignancy of what might have been.
Footfalls echo in the memory, down the passage which we did not take, towards the door we never opened into the rose garden. My words echo thus in your mind, but to what purpose? Disturbing the dust on a bowl of rose leaves, I do not know.
In this poem of echoes and ghosts, Eliot ends by musing on the similarity between poetry and music. Appreciating this connection can help us when it comes to understanding his work. A cherished piece for him was the A minor string quartet, Opus 132 by Beethoven. He called it a heavenly joy. Writing Four Quartets, Eliot believed that each poem could work the same way as chamber music, like this. So he made the structure of each poem follow sonata form, where a theme is first introduced, then developed, and finally repeated. That wasn't the only way in which Eliot composed these poems. He believed their very fabric
should be like music. Every word, every syllable, like separate notes. The poem is felt emotionally, it's heard like music, before it is understood. And Eliot didn't just believe there was one interpretation only of a poem. He once wrote, "What a poem means is as much what it means to others as what it means to its author."
Preoccupation with time in Burnt Norton continued in Eliot's second quartet. Inspiration came from an interest in his family history that took him to Somerset and the village of East Coker. It was here that an ancestor, Andrew Eliot, had lived before leaving for America in the 1660s. So, for Thomas Stearns Eliot, communing here with the spirits of the past, East Coker was a place for meditation on beginnings and ends.
In my beginning is my end. In succession, houses rise and fall, crumble or extended, are removed, destroyed, restored, or in their place is an open field or a factory or a bypass.
As well as themes of time, past, present and future, Eliot supplied another layer of meaning and metaphor to this poetry.
As he was writing the Four Quartets, it occurred to Eliot that each of the four poems could be related to one of the elements in ancient Greek philosophy: air, earth, fire, water. So Burnt Norton, with its airy philosophizing about the nature of time, related to air. And East Coker, which is a poem about roots, related to the earth. The poem begins with a wonderful evocation of life in this village in the 17th century. And it ends with a passage about how life doesn't get any easier as we age, nor is it easier to connect with the generations that went before. Home is where one starts from. As we grow older, the world becomes stranger, the pattern more complicated of dead and living. Not the intense moment, isolated with no before and after, but a lifetime, burning in every moment. And not the lifetime of one man only, but of old stones that cannot be deciphered.
In his third quartet, Eliot turned from earth to water, allowing his imagination to travel back across the Atlantic Ocean. In its opening lines, Eliot summons up the vast Mississippi River of his childhood, calling it a strong brown god, sullen, untamed, and intractable, patient to some degree. He then writes that the river is within us, the sea is all about us.
For Eliot, the sea is eternal, beyond history or human control. He knew from personal experience how dangerous and unpredictable it was sailing in these waters. But any journey into the unknown is a kind of hope. To cross the water requires belief, and that's an act of faith, which is mirrored in the spiritual journey that Eliot made in the Four Quartets.
This poem is called The Dry Salvages, after a group of rocks that Eliot sailed past in his youth. So he knew exactly what he was writing about when invoking the sea. He uses each word and phrase to build up an intensity of mood, painting vivid poetic pictures.
The sea has many voices, many gods and many voices. The salt is on the briar rose, the fog is in the fir trees. The sea howl and the sea yelp are different voices, often together heard. the whine in the rigging, the menace and caress of wave that breaks on water, the distant rote in the granite teeth, and the wailing warning from the approaching headland are all sea voices.
Musings on time and history, the natural world, and the elements, all these permeate Eliot's writing of Four Quartets. But it is also important to understand they were written leading up to and during the Second World War, and that the last of these, Little Gidding, was written during the London Blitz. In the momentous year of his conversion, Eliot had become a British citizen. Now, in wartime, he wanted to do his bit for king and country. When the bombs began to drop from his lodgings in South Kensington, and here, on the roof of the Faber building, Eliot undertook fire-watching duties. He witnessed the destruction caused by a German bomber, who in the poem he calls the dark dove with the flickering tongue, and writes of a moment after an air raid between the last bomb and the all clear.
Dust in the air suspended marks the place where a story ended. Dust inbreathed was a house, the wall, the wainscot, and the mouse. The death of hope and despair, this is the death of air.
Writing Little Gidding was a patriotic act for Eliot, a poem for a nation at war. On completion, it was quickly aired on the BBC. Such was its importance. But it speaks to themes beyond the moment of its wartime broadcast.
The primal element of Little Gidding is fire. It's not only the destructive fire of the London Blitz, it's also a spiritual fire which redeems and purifies. Let me read you the last lines of the poem, in which I think you see Eliot's life moving towards its poetic conclusion. And he's quoting from the medieval mystic Julian of Norwich. And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, when the tongues of flame are infolded into the crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one. This is a moment of transcendence, but also a kind of resolution. Here we see Eliot coming down to earth, accepting the human condition with all its frailties and all the mistakes we make. All shall be well.
At the end of the war, Eliot was 56. His eminence had earned him the title, the Pope of Russell Square. He could look out from Faber and know that Bloomsbury was now his. Honorary degrees poured in. He accepted the Nobel Prize for Literature. Eliot also showed a lighter side, publishing his book of practical cats with such characters as Rum Tum Tugger, Mr. Mistopheles, and Macavity. The illustrations for this first edition are his. He was a successful dramatist too. His play, The Cocktail Party, became a West End hit. But you won't be surprised to know that Eliot found celebrity the most lonely business. Real personal happiness still eluded him, and he remained haunted by the past. Vivien spent nearly 10 years in an asylum. He never visited. And when, in January 1947, He heard that she died suddenly from heart failure. He reportedly covered his face with his hands and cried out, "Oh God, oh God!" Why such a reaction? I think it was because of all the overwhelming torment and sadness and, above all, guilt about what he had and hadn't done for his wife. Of course, it was now possible for Eliot to marry Emily Hale as she hoped and commit to a relationship begun all those years before in Boston. Eliot didn't want to. And again, when another woman friend suggested that she became the second Mrs. Eliot, he turned her down. He told her he was emotionally spent, and he said he was still frightened of women. But in old age, Eliot was able to dare to love again. 10 years after Vivien's death, he did remarry his secretary. He was 68, Valerie was 30. During the 8 years they had together, the couple were inseparable, always seen at parties and premieres, hand in hand, arm in arm. Eliot was happy, and it seems sexually fulfilled too. With the woman he called this radiant angel, he had found an earthly paradise. Eliot once wrote to an old friend that his poetry had cost him dearly in experience. With Valerie, he never did write another great poem. Perhaps he didn't need to. Eliot died on the 4th of January 1965 at the age of 76. The second movement of Beethoven's 7th Symphony, another passion, was played at his funeral. He instructed that his ashes be interred here at St. Michael and All Angels Church in East Coker, his place of ancestors. Valerie joined him 47 years later.
Over 50 years after his death, T.S. Eliot's poetic voice is not silent. A difficult writer, yes. But Eliot said poets have to be difficult because they live in complex times. Faced by what he saw as the cultural ruins of his own day, he fought a heroic battle against the easy cliché and the journalistic half-truth. "These fragments have I shored against my ruins," he wrote in The Waste Land. And I fear that in our own day, we too are fed easy slogans by politicians and the media. So we need his poetry, because poetry, real poetry, is uniquely able to tell the truth. In Little Gidding, he saw his function as to purify the dialect of the tribe. So we too should resist easy language. We should listen. Listen to him.